All Cooper CPAs, located in the heart of East Nashville, offer a wide variety of tax services for individuals and businesses. Contact them at 615-257-0646 and visit their website, allcooper.com, for a full list of services.
Well, hello, everybody. Get ready. Coming up next on Political Soup. After the coldest March in a long time in Nashville, we're still talking about global warming. Also, the elephants. Yes, the elephants won. We'll talk about planes, trains, and pipelines. And, of course, we'll also talk about all the fun things for teenagers to do in Chicago. That and more coming up next with Crom Carmichael on Political Soup.
Bandwidth for today's show is brought to you by SoftLayer.com. We love SoftLayer here at Talkapolis. They are the greatest hosting company ever. They make everything easy. Check out their website at SoftLayer.com. Thanks again for sponsoring the show.
Talkapolis, the social media TV network for your city.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome into this edition of Political Soup. I'm Joe Williams, along with the expert, Crom Carmichael. And Crom, we took a week or so off. I would call it an Easter break. There are others who would call it a spring break, but that's for a whole nother show,
Boy,
I think.
very controversial, the difference between those two terms.
But welcome back. I hope you had a good time.
We did. We went down and visited my mother down in Florida for a bit, and then our daughter went to Nicaragua on a mission trip, so she came back. She came home for a weekend over Easter.
That's good.
So we've had a good last few weeks.
That's good. Of course, Easter coming at the end of March this year, real early Easter, and a real cold one too. At least the month of March, according to the National Weather Service here in Nashville, the coldest March in some 20 years or so.
Yes.
But we're still fighting global warming.
Well, you know what's interesting, Joe? I saw an article. I have been a skeptic of global warming. Now, I want to be sure that we're very clear on something. I divide environmental concerns into two broad categories. One is pollution, which I'm against pollution.
Right.
I want clean air, I want clean water. And the other is the global warming, where everybody is claiming that even our breath increases the carbon footprint and therefore will lead to the demise of the world.
Yes.
That's the so-called global warming part that I've been skeptical about for decades.
Okay.
And The Economist magazine, which has been one of the magazines that has been drummed, and it's a very prestigious magazine, well read all throughout Europe, and the elites in the United States read it frequently. Well, they had an editorial where they said, you know, it's interesting that in the last 15 years, the amount of carbon, now once again, this is not the pollution type thing, this is carbon, like what we breathe.
Okay.
There's been 100 billion tons of carbon have been added to the atmosphere between 2000 and 2010, so it's actually not 15 years in what they're talking about, but over 10 years, and it's saying that the temperature hasn't changed. And it can't understand, it says this creates a puzzle. Well, actually it doesn't create a puzzle, it demonstrates that the scientific projections are false. Now, they say that there are three ways to think about this. One is that there might be a temporary lag between more carbon dioxide and rising temperatures, or the temperature rising in the 90s might have been an anomaly, or three, the climate is responding to higher CO2 levels in ways that scientists don't understand.
You think?
Well, there you go. It has to be, by definition, it has to be the third.
Do they understand the number? What was it, 100 billion?
100 billion.
Tons.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's 100 billion tons of CO2, which is what we exhale.
Sure.
Now, the world recycles CO2.
Yeah.
Now, and we're not talking about dirty air, we're talking about CO2. And so what you have is you've got the environmentalists now are all up in a dither. Now, in a related subject, you have two other little stories here that I kind of happened across. One is on the wind subsidies, and this is a perfect example of why Obama's subsidies and cronyism is such a bad idea. What's happened is in 2009, and by the way, this is not an attack on Barack Obama alone. Republicans were part of this. This is cronyism at its worst, and the cronies in this case are the wind power companies that go to the federal government that have been getting great big subsidies.
Oh, yes.
30% of the cost of building a wind farm is paid for by you and me and the other taxpayers.
Right.
we derive zero benefit, and here's why. The cost of producing the cost of a megawatt hour prior to the subsidy was $37. The cost now is $54. Now, if you look at what's the difference between 54 and 37 as a percentage,
yes,
it's 30%.
Really?
Yeah. And so what the taxpayers are doing is it is paying wind farm operators to be inefficient. It is paying them to be inefficient. So the tax credit is being recycled into the pockets of those who are closest to the politicians, which is why, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, you ought to be against government subsidies, period. So that's what we learned from that. Now, the other little story that's related to that that's interesting is a story about the tale of two oil spills.
Yes.
You've got two types of ways of transporting oil from the field to a refinery. One is by train, and one is by pipeline.
Right.
Now, historically, pipelines have been much safer in moving oil from the field to a refinery.
Probably always will be.
But when there is a crack or a break in an oil pipeline and there's a spill, that becomes news. When a train has one, it's not news. And that's what's interesting here. Now, as I read through the story, I found out in here that it turns out that Warren Buffett, one of the people who is most praised by the left, because you see he's for higher taxes on everybody except himself. Okay, he's the richest man in the country, but the way he handles his affairs, he won't be affected by higher tax rates. But turns out that Berkshire Hathaway owns, guess what?
Railroads.
Railroads. And so they've seen their traffic hauling oil rise dramatically, even though hauling oil by train is a lot worse for the environment than moving it by pipeline.
It's a higher risk. It's it's more costly, and yeah, you're burning carbon fuels, fossil fuels to make it move.
Sure, yeah, a lot more than doing it through a pipeline. So there's nothing that says that hauling by train is better, except that Warren Buffett gets to put a lot of money in his pocket.
Well, the other half to that is if you look at the Surface Transportation Board, controls railroads, and they are an entirely different animal.
Okay.
Entirely separate. They're not regulated by EPA, DOT, or any of this. It's almost a category unto themselves. The wind farm, the last time we were here, we were talking about wind farms and eagles getting in and being killed, and that's not a big deal because that's
400,000 birds a year are killed by wind farms, and the Audubon Society and PETA more or less just look the other way.
But the wind farms get a break. I mean, they're kind of an animal unto themselves with that. Same way with railroads. They are an animal unto themselves under the board and can do almost anything they want to.
Okay, well,
that starts to explain why. Yeah.
So at any rate, I just thought that when we talk about global warming, we talk about regulations and whatnot. I think it's important to know the facts, to understand what they mean, and then to try to figure out, okay, what needs to be done. And the solution is not better subsidies. No. The solution is no subsidies.
Now, we brought up the birds, and you rang the bell. You said the magic word. PETA, our friends at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Of course, we had a long discussion with Mike.
Well, the Audubon Society looks the other way when wind farms kill birds.
Right.
Okay, and the Audubon Society is supposed to be trying to protect birds, especially eagles.
Right.
Okay. Now, if a farmer happens to kill an eagle, that can be criminal. That is civil. All these different things. But wind farms can actually get a permit to kill eagles. Now, PETA, as we talked about the other day, kills dogs and cats as a matter of policy.
At an alarming rate.
At over 90%.
Right.
Okay, so that's PETA. The People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals kill them.
But there are other groups.
That's right. There are others, and this is a great story. The company that owns the Barnum and Bailey Circus was sued about 10 years ago.
I remember that, actually.
Okay, was sued because the claim was that they mistreat animals, specifically elephants.
Right.
Well, a judge has recently ruled that those organizations that sued the company that owns the Barnum and Bailey Circus must pay the legal fees for the Barnum and Bailey Circus, and they total over $20 million.
That's going to hurt. But
that's going to hurt.
As I recall, they had a whistleblower that had all the goods.
That's right. These groups, and let's see here. One of them settled, and this is for the American. Now this is a big one. The American Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. We've heard of them. They ended up paying $9.3 million. They settled. They wanted to get out. They settled and they paid 9.3. Then these other groups that are in here, one is Fund for Animals and the other is the Animal Welfare Institute. It's possible that those two may end up just going broke then reconstituting themselves under another name to avoid having to pay the claims.
Sure.
But they had a whistleblower, and that was their star witness. Well, it turns out that this star witness had been written up before he was fired. He'd been written up for being drunk. He had been written up for being abusive to the animals, and he had been written up for being absent and tardy at work on numerous occasions.
Wait a minute, he was whistleblowing on himself.
Well, more or less. So when he was put up on the witness stand, he was completely and utterly discredited, which is part of the reasoning for the judge is that if you don't have any facts to support your case, just because you think you can sue a big company and get them to settle, in this case, they were wrong. And so kudos to the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus for standing up for themselves in court. And I hope the judge chases these people down, and maybe even the boards of directors of these two companies if they try to file for bankruptcy, and see if they might be able to extract a little money, because they do that in the private sector now.
Yeah, you know what really amazed me about that story, and I do remember when that case was filed, and I remember thinking to myself, why would the circus with the elephants being probably the single biggest trademark, if you will,
sure,
of the Barnum and Bailey circus. Why would you abuse the golden goose?
Well, they didn't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it didn't make any sense then. It doesn't make any sense now.
But I mean, so anyway, it's the lions, it's the tigers. They do a great job, and plus they provide wonderful entertainment for families. And so anyway, good story here to see another so-called, and I say so-called, animal rights group get their butt handed to them.
I think he enjoyed that.
Yes,
Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! More to come when we return to Political Soup. Stay with us.
All Cooper CPAs, located in the heart of East Nashville, offer a wide variety of tax services for individuals and businesses. Contact them at 615-257-0646 and visit their website, allcooper.com, for a full list of services.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to Political Soup. Crom Carmichael, Joe Williams. And Crom, we are inching ever closer to the implementation date for the Affordable Health Care Act.
Mm-hmm. Talking about something misnamed.
Well, I was going to ask you. Every time I turn around, the regs the number of pages in the regulations are getting larger, and with every page, it's going to cost a little more.
Well, you have about 30 states now that have said to the federal government, we're not setting up a state exchange, and thankfully Tennessee is one of those, and told the federal government they're going to have to. The response last week was that the federal exchange will provide people with how many options of different plans? One.
Really?
Yeah, that's because they can't figure out how to offer more than one. So they're going to be offering one. Now, by the way, that's down from Obama's promise of multiple choices. So that's number one. But here's what's interesting. First of all, let's remember what the act does. Now, by the way, it's over 20,000 pages have been issued and more to come. But let's remember what it does. It says that children up until they're 26 can remain on their parents' policy. Number two, it says you cannot discriminate based on age for insurance purposes, which absolutely just nails young people because now they're having to pay higher premiums even though statistically they're much healthier than other people. That's number three. You cannot not insure somebody based on a pre-existing condition. And number four, there is no lifetime cap. So you cannot say after $1 million the insurance doesn't go into play. So all of those things added together will drive insurance premiums much, much higher. Some of those things have already been in effect, and so you've seen insurance premiums begin to go up. But in just 1 week, in the Wall Street Journal, here's a front page story, insurers see jump in health premiums. Then it goes on to say that in some states it might be as much as 70% jump in insurance premiums.
Why that much?
Well, because those states had a lot more flexibility in the past and their premiums were generally lower. And now that the federal government is saying this is what you must do, it's taking away the flexibility and driving the costs up. And it's based on what I said earlier.
Right.
Caps, elimination of caps, elimination of pre-existing conditions and all these different things. And so premiums are going to go up. Then on the 28th, that was on the 22nd, then on the 28th, chains cut their health law tabs. Now what they're talking about chains here is they're talking about restaurant chains. What they're doing is they're saying to employees, we talked about, go ahead.
Is this not the same thing we've talked about before? Hey, when this goes through, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to just cut everybody back to 25 hours.
29.
29.
30 is there are two numbers to remember.
Okay.
30 and 50. 30 is the number of hours. If you work 30 hours, you're considered full-time. Anything less than 30 hours, then you don't have to offer them insurance.
Okay.
And the other is if you have less than 50 employees.
Okay.
Then you're
30-50 rule. That's
so
right.
the old 30-50 rule.
So, but this has been this has kind of been the end of the road that we've been riding the whole time, and that is when it comes down to it, okay, so I cut staff and I cut the hours they work, and I don't got to do it. As we used to say, well, I ain't got to do this no more.
Right. Now, and then the individuals are not going to sign up for Obamacare themselves, even though they get a big subsidy. They're not going to sign up for one reason. They cannot be denied coverage for pre-existing conditions. So what a lot of people will actually do is they'll carry around their application in their pocket signed, and if they have to go to the hospital, they'll present it as they're entering the hospital to get insurance to cover their stay in the hospital. Now people say, oh, they won't do that. Absolutely
Sure
they will do that. It's the logic. You know, why pay $10,000 or $15,000 a year for insurance when you don't have to have it? You just hand it to them and you get insurance for 2 weeks and then cancel it. So we're going to see some of that too, which by the way, that also drives up the cost of insurance premiums for those who are paying them on a regular basis.
Sure.
That was on the 28th. Then on the 29th, the very next day, here's another story. Insurance prices could jump. And then once again, it gives from a different perspective. Well, when I say different perspective, it's a different writer coming up with the same conclusion. And this one is primarily focused on how young people are going to end up being, they're just going to end up paying tremendous amounts of insurance, and to the extent that they are in businesses that can adjust their hours down to 29, they're going to see their pay cut and their insurance premiums go up. So that's a pretty rotten thing.
You know, I've two situations in my past that I'm familiar with. One in one particular organization that I worked for, as we were evaluating employees, and everybody was happy, and when they got everybody got decent, pretty good raises. They got a raise, then they got hit with the insurance increase, and they came into me going, Joe, how am I taking home less money?
Yeah.
I just got a raise. How am I? And this is going to happen again.
Absolutely. Now let's be sure, Joe, that one thing that I try to make sure that we cover on this show is I don't want to identify a problem without identifying the solution.
All right.
The problem is the third-party payment system is very, very expensive to operate. People have insurance for their homes for big-ticket items.
Right.
People have insurance for their cars for when they have a wreck.
Right.
They don't insure to buy a tank of gas. They don't insure to do an oil change. They don't insure for tires. They don't even insure for transmissions, which might be $2,500. Yet, if we go into a doctor's office or if we go to get a $20 prescription, it's insured. And now all of these other companies and parties get involved in adjudicating the final payment. All of that costs a tremendous amount. And I would argue that a doctor visit, if there was no insurance, none at all, a doctor visit would cost $30 to $40. People can pay $30 to $40. What should be insured in health care? The big ticket item, the hospitalization. And if that were all that was insured, then even that price would be a lot lower, because that's where the insurance companies would focus their energies on trying to manage costs. That's where they would do it instead of this absolutely ridiculous cover everything plan. So
if you could get it down to $30 to $40, I mean, that's kind of a copay now.
That's right. That's right.
So you're actually paying what it should cost. Everything the insurance is piling on is going to administrative costs somewhere.
That's right. You've got millions of people who are in the insurance industry. And by the way, I'm not attacking them. I'm saying the system itself is so bloated with bureaucracy because of all the government regulations. It is the way it is because of government policy. It's not the way it is because that's how consumers want it.
So the other situation, and this bugged me for a while, but 25 years ago when the HMOs were the hot ticket.
Right.
Worked for a company that we had an HMO. And, for at the time, it was just my wife and I. It wasn't a bad deal. But it cost me, for my wife and I, the same amount as it cost a friend of mine in another department for his wife, and their 8 kids.
Okay.
And I just, there was an equity question to me there.
Well, even with HMOs, they tried to funnel you to particular providers. They still had to have a third-party payment system.
Yeah.
It is the third-party payment system that costs so much money. When I go to the doctor, there are 6 different companies, 6 different times that a company has to touch that invoice before it's finally paid.
Okay.
So it takes a $30 bill and drives it up to $100.
All right, then let me ask you this question. Why not have a single payer system, as in
It'd be the same thing.
a government single payer system?
It'd still be the same thing. You still would have to have all these different. The insurance company would be similar to the government, just like Medicare and Medicaid, except the amount of fraud in Medicare and Medicaid is absolutely an immense amount of money. And so a single payer system doesn't solve the problem. It would be like saying, well, HMOs will work, but then they didn't work. Well, Obamacare will work, and it won't work. Well, let's go to a single payer. Well, you know what? Why not just let the person pay like you go to the grocery store? When you go to the grocery store and you buy $30 worth of groceries, you pay. And it doesn't cost much. The transaction cost is less than 1%. And even if you use a debit card, what is it, 1.25%? Think about that. If you could pay by debit card, and if you want to set it up with HSA, so everybody has a debit card for healthcare for these lower cost things, then your payment system is going to change from being 50% to 60% of the cost to 1. That will drive the cost down, make healthcare affordable. So that's where you have it. In kind of a related story, I saw an interesting article about, you saw this stuff over the weekend about this wilding, these teenagers wilding in Chicago. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about in the most affluent shopping area in the country.
But wait a minute now. It's the first warm weekend. Me and my friends just wanted to go for a walk, and they had friends, and it just happened to be 300 or 400 of us at the same place at the same time.
Yeah. Taking money from the people walking down the street and mugging them. Here's what's interesting about Chicago, and the reason it kind of ties into this thing with Obamacare is that's where Obama cut his teeth on politics and everything else that kind of informs his life.
Yeah.
Look at Chicago. It has among the strictest gun laws in the country, yet it's the murder capital of the country. Number 2, it is the cronyism in Chicago is unparalleled in the amount of corruption. Listen to this. From 1976 to 2010, there were 1,531, let me say that again, 1,531 public employees. This is people who worked for the city who were convicted and put in prison for corruption. Now think about when we have, how often do we have somebody who's indicted and convicted in Nashville? 2 or 3 a year?
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be a big year.
5 in the whole state. Well, okay.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, but this is a city. Now, Chicago is 3 or 4 times bigger than Nashville.
Okay.
1,500 in Chicago.
In what period of time?
In 25 years.
All right, so that's an average of 60 a year.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, and by the way, those are the ones that get caught.
Yeah.
And the shakedown racket in Chicago with property taxes and everything else, it is systemic. It's the way the city operates. The people who get convicted are the ones who get overly greedy. If you're just merely greedy, you don't get caught because it's part of the system. These are the ones who, even the greedy people who work for the government. And so, at any rate, I just find it fascinating, but I'm not surprised. And by the way, this is a precursor of what you're going to see, I think, in other big cities.
Well, but is it not also draw a parallel there? First off, I want to take up some for public employees. Out of the 1,500 there's probably 30, 40,000 who still do a good job and do a fair job. But it is these problem children that always seem to bring it up, get caught, and just ruins it for everybody. I mean, folks who really are committed to doing a public service.
Chicago, it's very hard to be. It's very hard in Chicago to be a completely honest public employee, especially if you rise up. You see the TV program, which I love, Person of Interest.
Yes.
And they have the HR.
Yeah.
And the corrupt members of HR.
Oh, yeah.
Chicago has a lot of HR in it.
Well, I was just say, but I'm going to take up for them just like I'm going to take up for some teachers to an extent. But, you have this many done this way kind of parallels with what's going on in Atlanta right now.
Oh, my gosh.
With the education system down there.
I read about that, and you are right. I mean, this was systemic in Atlanta. From the top and all the way down.
And bullied down.
Yes, bullied down, requiring teachers to falsify test grades.
Change grades.
Oh.
Yeah. In case you haven't heard, there are 28 members, including the director of schools, indicted for changing grades. They got big stipends because the test scores went up. And so they made the test scores go up. And if the test scores didn't go up, they made them go up anyway.
Yeah, and a bunch of teachers got indicted too.
Yeah.
I mean, and what's sad about that is it went on for years.
Yes,
so you
10 years worth of this.
Yeah, so you have children who went into the school in the first grade who were subject to this corruption, and they got a terrible education.
Yeah, they go to the 10th grade reading at a second grade level, even though they passed all the proficiency tests at a high standard.
Yeah, yeah. Now, here in Tennessee, you've got two things going on, which are interesting. One is you've got to move toward vouchers, which I have been supporting since the time you had to actually define what a voucher was,
right?
Which is 25 years ago, and I think that's just great because it gives parents the tools and the choice of where to send their their child to school.
Right.
That's number one, and then number two is you've got this law that says that if you are collecting welfare and your child is failing, that it looks like it's going to pass through the House and the Senate. That there's certain things that you as a parent have to do, and you're given choices. And it could be as little as attending parent-teacher meetings or enrolling your child in summer school. In other words, all of these things are things to essentially force.
Right.
Or let me change that word. It's not force. It's to encourage.
Okay.
Because if you don't do it, you don't have to, but you will get your government payments cut.
Well, and teachers have struggled for years with the fact that we do all we can, but if we don't have support from home, if there's not a firm home life, then no matter how well we teach, no matter how good we are at what we do, we can't reach the levels that we'd like to.
Yeah, and this bill essentially says if your child is failing and you are collecting government payments and you're not attending parent-teacher, your child is not enrolled in summer school, and I think there was a third one. I'm going to pull a Rick Perry. I can't remember the third one.
Attendance or something.
Yeah, attendance. Yeah, it could be attendance. If then you have to do one of those three in order to maintain your government subsidy, and I think that's entirely reasonable.
Kind of like having to pass a drug screen.
Well,
in Florida anyway.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. So at any rate, that's those. Oh, by the way, there's one other very interesting article in Chicago. We'll be very quick here, and this was written by William Daley, who actually served in the Obama administration. He points out that the fastest way to reduce gun violence, the fastest way, is to arrest people who are carrying a gun without a permit. If they're not entitled to carry the gun and they're caught with a gun, then they go to prison.
Well, that's everybody except a sworn officer in Chicago.
Well, it's a lot of folks, but in Chicago, in New York, when Giuliani took over as mayor of New York was the murder capital of the country.
Right.
And he put in a stop and frisk policy. Whereas if the police had the right to stop you and frisk you, and if they found a gun and you didn't have the right to carry it, you went to prison.
Okay.
The amount of violent crime in New York dropped. I mean, it dropped like 80 or 90%. It was tremendous how much it dropped over a 2 or 3 year period. So if you really are against gun violence, then what you need to do is you need to be able to arrest, convict, and imprison people. I don't care how long it is, because in New York, people don't carry guns illegally at nearly the rate they used to. And if you're not carrying a gun illegally, the chances of you using the gun are low because you don't have it.
But what about the cost of the court case, the length of time, and then the incarceration? Are you sure that people are going to want to pay the amount of money that it takes to take care of these folks?
Joe, what's interesting is there was initially a spike in arrests and convictions and prison time. It didn't take long, though, for the bad people to realize, you know what, carrying a gun is not worth it. And so they simply didn't carry the gun. If bad people are carrying guns, they will tend to use them more frequently than if bad people are not carrying guns. And so the penalty was such that people chose not to carry the gun. If Chicago wants to eliminate gun violence, that's what it needs to do. And a person who served in the Obama administration and who lives in Chicago is saying exactly that. So I applaud Bill Daley for saying that.
Yep, you heard it here first. All right, we've gone a little long this segment. When we come back, we'll wrap all this up with a very dynamic final 5 minutes. We'll be back after this.
Bandwidth for today's show is brought to you by SoftLayer.com. We love SoftLayer here at Talkapolis. They are the greatest hosting company ever. They make everything easy. Check out their website at SoftLayer.com. Thanks again for sponsoring the show.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Final segment of Political Soup with Crom Carmichael. I'm Joe Williams, and Crom, we promised him a dynamic final 5 minutes, and we're going to get the dynamics from, get ready for this, the Congressional Budget Office. Who would have ever thought the Congressional Budget Office would supply us with a dynamic ending?
Well, there are two ways of thinking about how to predict what the revenue from a change in the tax code. One is called static scoring. The other is called dynamic scoring.
Okay.
Congress has historically required the CBO to use what is called static scoring.
And what's that mean?
Well, let's say that the current tax rate is 50%. Let's just say we're 50%. And let's say that Congress said, tell me what would happen if I raised the tax rate to 100%. Now, we both know that if you're paying 100% in taxes, you're not going to work at all. Exactly. We know that, okay? But the Congressional Budget Office would say that revenues would double because from 50 to 100 is doubling. That's the static model.
That's stupid.
Well,
I'm sorry, I can't find another, forgive me, I just can't find another word for it.
Well, and then when they say, when they're asked, well, how did you miss by such an enormous amount? They say, well, because I did it the way they told me to do it. In other words, what they say is, if Congress says that 5 plus 5 equals 40, then that's what they will report, even though we know that 5 plus 5 equals 10. The CBO will do what they are told. If they're given rules that are false, they still have to play by those false rules. Now, what dynamic scoring attempts to do is it says, okay, if you change the tax rate, will it change behavior? Now, if you reduce the tax rate, will it encourage certain activity? If you increase the tax rate, will it encourage or discourage certain activities? And so here's a perfect example. The Congressional Budget Office was asked to score, this is his history now, was asked to score what would happen if you cut the tax rate from the capital gains rate from 20% to 15%. They came back and said that if that were to happen, that the revenue would drop from $69 billion to $65 billion in capital gains. But the rate was cut, and so what actually happened? The amount of revenue went up to $109 billion in 2006, which was the first year, and then it went to $126 billion in 2007. So they missed by almost 100%.
Yeah.
In other words, they predicted 65, and in 2 years it was 126. Now, the same thing is true on personal tax rates. If you raise taxes on work, there's a point at which you will get less work.
Sure.
If you increase benefits to not work, you will end up encouraging people to not work.
Right.
And so let us applaud those members of the Senate, and some of them are Democrats, who voted to have the CBO to provide the Senate at least, and I don't know why the House Republicans don't require this, because it would make for better government, and it also would show that if you raise taxes, it will have an effect on people's behavior. If you lower taxes, it will have an effect on behavior. And then the CBO can't complain that they missed simply because, well, they're following the rules that Congress provided.
Why not do it both ways?
Yeah,
Why not do it both ways and have a range and go, okay, somewhere in here is where we're going to be. I mean, that would seem to be the common sense thing to do.
Well, actually, it may be somewhere in here is correct, but it may be that if they consistently do the dynamic scoring and it shows a particular result, then you know that that's a much better result than the static, and then you just throw out the static.
The one thing I read, because I went back and read that article, and one thing that worried me a little bit, we think about it can't get any worse. Did I not read in there that President Kennedy in the early 60s was asking what would happen if we dropped the top level of taxes from 91 to
70.
It was 70%.
Yeah.
So at one point, anyway, the top personal tax rate in this country was 91%.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was the year I was born, quite
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah. So when Kennedy took office, he cut it to 70. Then what happened was, just for a very brief little deal here, then from then all the way until Reagan became president, it stayed at 70, but the brackets didn't change. So when you had the inflation in the 70s,
everybody
got bumped up into higher and higher and higher tax rates. And I mean, I think, you have to go back and check, but I think the top tax rate in 1979 of 70% hit at $59,000.
Oh my.
So and then Reagan came in and he cut it to 50, then he cut it to 28, and you had 8 years
of massive
growth. Higher incomes, greater employment, and even when Clinton, let's remember, Clinton cut the capital gains tax rate from 28% to 20%. We had a surplus. We ran a surplus. The amount of federal spending under Clinton as a share of the economy, even though federal spending continued to grow, as a share of the economy, because the economy grew so much in his last 4 years, it dropped from 21% to 18%. So people who say that you have to stimulate the economy with more government spending, the facts absolutely prove that that is false. After World War II, federal spending dropped like 70% in 12 months.
No war effort.
And the economy exploded. So all the facts support private sector growth, improves the number of people working, improves incomes, and improves prosperity. You can go back and look at any period in history. You can go back and look around the world. And I just wish that our friends in the media would do a little bit more of that.
If you've heard nothing else in all these political soups, that last little 3-minute segment from Crom, I think, is about as good as it gets.
Well, thanks, Joe.
Trying
Appreciate
to explain things. I mean,
Appreciate
it. Yeah, that just kind of, puts it there. There are some questions I still got to ask, but that's for another time. We've run out of time this week. Crom, have a great week.
Joe, you too.
Look forward to seeing you next week.
You bet.
What are you going to bring next week?
Don't know yet.
Oh, Lord, that worries me.
Have to read the paper.
For Crom Carmichael, I'm Joe Williams. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on Political Soup.